and I will start with the logistical stuff. We're now recording. So, hello, and welcome to Critical Information Literacy in Ideologically Pluralistic Classrooms, Exploring Challenges and Possibilities, brought to you by the ACRL University Library Section's Professional Development Committee. I'm Sam Harlow, my pronouns are she, her, hers, and I am the co-chair of this committee. I will be moderating this program along with my colleague, Leeanne Romane, my fellow committee member. This is one of the ongoing series of online programs sponsored by our committee. So if you would like to see the other programs we've done and see the programs we have coming up that are ready, I just dropped the link to the LibGuide in the chat. So before I introduce our presenters, I'm going to cover a few logistics. This session is being recorded, and when the recording is ready, we will send the link of the video, slides, and any other supplemental documentation to everyone who registered for the program. The program will run for an hour total, including time for questions. Please feel free to add questions in the chat box throughout the presentation at any time. Leeanne will be collating them and will be prepared to read them to our panelists, who I will introduce in a moment at the appropriate time. As you use the chat feature, please make sure you send your messages to all panelists and attendees so everyone can see what you're asking, or if you're sharing a link. We will post a link to a program assessment in the chat box after the Q&A session. So please take a few moments to give us your feedback on today's programs. With those announcements out of the way, I am very happy to start today's program. Just a quick reminder about the chat again, if you just came in. If you'd like to pose a question, please make sure you are directing it to all participants and all panelists and attendees. This will ensure everyone, as opposed to just the presenter, will see your questions. So today our panelists are Andrea Baer, a librarian since 2011 and a teacher since 2002, is the History and Political Science librarian at Romane University. Sara Miller is the librarian for interdisciplinary teaching and learning initiatives at Michigan State University, partnering with the General Education Integrative Studies programs for information literacy integration. Gabe Ording is a faculty member in the Department of Etymology and is the director of the Center for Integrative Studies in General Science at Michigan State University. And Dr. Claudia Vergara is an academic specialist in curricula, design, and evaluation and a teacher. She directs the program evaluation and assessment of student learning in the Center for Integrative Studies in General Science at Michigan State University. And without further delay, I will hand it over to our panelists.
Thank you so much, and we're happy to be here today. Again, thank you for attending, and Sam's done such a great job of introducing us that we're just going to get started. So, again, these are us. So hello, I'm Sara Miller. I work with General Education. I'm a librarian at Michigan State University.
Hi, I'm Gabe Ording, the director of the Center for Integrative Studies in General Sciences.
Hi, I'm Claudia Vergara, and I am in charge of the program evaluation and assessment of student learning in the center, and I also teach the course.
And I'm Andrea Baer. I'm the History and Political Science librarian at Romane University. All right, so some of you have already seen these links that are also in the chat. We're going to put them in the chat one more time. So if you came in a little early, you may have already had a chance to get started here. But we'd like, before we get into the content of today, for you to just take a moment to answer the first question in one of these Google Docs. And you can see that the Google Docs have been assigned based on your last name. So if you can go to the link for the Google Doc that's relevant to your last name. And that first question is, what polarizing topics or situations have come up for you in your experience? This might be your teaching experience, it might be other professional experience, or it could also be personal experience. And we will be returning to this document later on in the session and engaging with the second question. But right now, we're just focusing on that first question. And then hopefully some of the ideas that we're going to present will help you in kind of thinking in the background about that situation that you identified. So we'll take a moment to let you respond to that, and then we'll have a little bit more to share with you. And I hope you don't mind, we're peeking in on some of these documents just to see what kinds of things are coming up for you guys. And I can tell you guys have a lot of interesting experiences, so it'll be fun to hear more from you a little bit later. All right, we're gonna go ahead and move on. But again, keep those things in mind because we'll be coming back to them. So we wanted to give you a little bit of context for how we came to this panel. So we all have interest in critical information literacy and critical pedagogy, and we all bring that into our teaching. And we found that this is particularly important at this time of political polarization, and it's also particularly challenging, I think. You know, the same things that make it so important to be thinking about things like social justice and having an inclusive classroom, they also are simultaneously challenges. So the catalyst for us coming together was initially a book that you see there on this slide, Libraries Promoting Reflective Dialogue in a Time of Political Polarization. I co-edited this with my colleagues, Elisa Stern-Cahoy and Rob Schroeder. And we, at the time, started talking about how we were really grappling a lot with how we were teaching and how we were engaging in librarianship at a very highly polarized moment. And so we decided to put out a call for proposals for book chapters for this book that you see. And Sara, Gabe, and Claudia were among those who submitted and had a chapter in here. And they talked in their chapter in particular about science education and information literacy, integrating information literacy into science education in a very polarized environment, including when issues come up where students may have strong views about things like climate change or evolution. So in working with them in their developing that chapter, I realized I had a shared interest with them because I was also teaching a credit-bearing information literacy course where I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment, but I was finding some connections between what I was doing and what they were doing. And you can see there is the book website at the bottom of this slide. So if you go there, you can see the list of chapters, and there are a number of chapters that have been made available open access. So I'll give you a little bit of context for my class. So I started teaching this credit-bearing course at the University of West Georgia in 2016. In the fall of 2016, more specifically, right when Trump was running for election and then was elected. And then I taught it until 2018. So this was a very interesting time for me to be teaching this class. This is a racially diverse campus, and it's also a campus in which students have different ideologies, different political views. Some are kind of apolitical, but you know, a lot of them, there is some kind of tension in differing ideologies. So this really got me thinking more actively about how to foster a positive class climate that's based on mutual respect and a valuing of difference when people sometimes will disagree on issues that can be heated. And it also got me thinking about our relationships to information and information environments, including in relation to our own belief systems. What I ended up ultimately doing was making this a theme of the course. So a lot of the concepts, theories, and research that we're going to talk about shortly are things that became key parts of my credit course.
So at Michigan State University, the bulk of our general education is primarily accommodated through 3 centers for integrative studies. Most of our students take a total of 24 credits that are distributed across a combination of the Center for Arts and Humanities, the Center for Social Science, and the Center for Integrative Studies and General Science, which is where Claudia and I come from. This was, integrative studies was really quite innovative when first developed about 30 years ago at Michigan State. I think though it's become pretty commonplace or quite familiar in recent years though. Since its creation here at Michigan State, integrative studies at Michigan State University has also had a diversity requirement. That diversity requirement historically had been accommodated only through courses in arts and humanities and social sciences. But as an element of recent curricular changes in our center, we thought we should adopt that because we have rich opportunities to engage students in issues related to diversity. And that's really been a profound change and has increased the opportunities to talk about these polarizing topics. Next slide, please. Specifically, our center, the Center for Integrative Studies and General Sciences, we serve roughly 12,000 students annually, and these are primarily non-STEM majors. We offer them a combination of 3 classes, 2 lecture courses, and a lab class. Turns out that for most of these students, this will probably be the last final scientific experience course that they'll take. So we feel it's really important that we do a great job of delivering sound science, but also helping them recognize how science fits into their own lives. The mission of our center is to foster scientific literacy. Again, primarily we're serving the non-STEM majors, and realizing that this is our last shot at this part of our student body. The faculty have, through collaborative reform efforts, tried to identify what should the foundation of our course and our curriculum be, and we've arrived at 3 primary pillars, and that includes scientific literacy, quantitative literacy, and information literacy. And relative to information literacy, we've adopted and identified actually a combination of competencies that are basically derived from the ACRL framework. We're really excited about that. We're happy to have Sara Miller as a partner in that process. So especially with the addition of the diversity requirement, our integrative studies and general science courses provide a really unique opportunity for students to engage in thinking about the intersection between science and society, considering the really complex relationships between science and non-science. And again, especially with the diversity requirement embedded, we're talking about culturally polarizing topics that lots of folks don't have necessarily the same thought processes about, like climate change or vaccinations, evolution. Many of these items end up having a really significant social justice component associated. So this provides opportunities to talk about different perspectives, and we encourage our students to consider different stakeholders that might be involved in each of these conversations, and the strength of the voices of these different stakeholders and how we don't all necessarily have equal representation. And we talk about why that's going to be the case. And throughout our program, we have to brace our faculty for, you'll be engaging students for whom many of these are hot topics, and we'll talk more about that.
So in this slide, we're showing 3 competencies that highlight the way in which we operationalize information literacy for our students. So we want our students to understand the value of information as a way to explore and generate ideas. This entails things like selecting information sources that are relevant and of good quality. We also want them to understand the importance of critically evaluating information, and through this critical thinking process, students acquire and practice skepticism, which is very important when you are consuming and producing scientific information. And this also exposes our students to ideas that might take them, and hopefully will take them beyond their comfort zones and help them reflect upon their own biases, worldviews, preconceptions. We want our students finally to understand the multiple dimensions of value that information has. So in this context, they consider issues of representation and marginalization, like Gabe indicated, within the structures that produce and disseminate this information. They ask questions like, well, we engage them in asking questions like, how do these structures impact society, and how those structures impact them personally? And also students reflect upon their roles as members of communities where they are both consumers and producers of information.
Thanks, Claudia. So we're going to give a quick overview of some key principles of critical information literacy, which will be familiar to many of you, but we want to make sure that we're all on the same page. And then we'll think about those in relation to polarization, polarizing topics and situations. So a lot of what I'm going to present here was also very relevant to the information literacy course that I was teaching. So first, just to highlight some key principles of critical pedagogy. One is that students and teachers are co-learners and that everyone is learning in community. Another is learning really being driven by problem posing and critical inquiry, which happens largely through reflection on one's own experiences and others' experiences in the world. Another key thing is investigating assumptions. Stephen Brookfield in particular has done a lot of work on trying to challenge various types of assumptions, including what he calls hegemonic assumptions. That is, assumptions that are often societal and they're very deeply embedded in our culture. And these kinds of assumptions can be very, very hard to see because we already kind of live in that culture. And so he encourages looking at things through different lenses in order to try to challenge and investigate those assumptions. Critical pedagogy also focuses a lot on investigating the role of socio-cultural, socio-political, and socio-structural contexts on our worlds, particularly in relation to issues of social justice. And it looks at ways to address social inequities and to work for social justice. In critical pedagogy, students and teachers are looking at connections between themselves as individuals and the collective, looking at the connections between the personal and the political. So in an ideologically pluralistic classroom in which students may have different views, this can raise some questions about what critical pedagogy might look like. So some things that we might grapple with are, what can a class agree on? Where can they agree to disagree? What role does the teacher play as an authority in the classroom? And then how does a classroom remain open to differing perspectives and at the same time maintain an inclusive, safe, and welcoming class climate and not fall into absolute relativism? So the idea that all arguments or perspectives are equally valid. In a science classroom, should it be entertained that maybe climate change isn't real? So it gets Claudia and Gabe will be exploring more of this kind of thing when they're talking about science education. So I'm going to introduce a few concepts. These are evidence-based or research-supported concepts that were helpful for me in thinking through how to teach my information literacy course. And they were also ideas that students engaged with. So one is the idea of hot cognition. Hot cognition is the idea that when we have strong views about something, our thinking often becomes automatic and we don't even always know what kind of reasoning is going on in our heads. We've already kind of developed a certain view about something. And so we often will just have that automatic reaction. This is particularly likely to happen when you're talking about socio-political issues or concepts. These tend to trigger automatic responses. So these kinds of issues are often ones where we're more likely to have some kind of cognitive bias. There's been some interesting research done, and here I'm in particular citing a study by Lodge and Tabor from 2005, but it's not the only one. They found that becoming more informed about an issue actually makes people more susceptible to motivated reasoning, or that is, reasoning the way that one wants to reason. So actually having more difficulty looking at other perspectives when one is more informed, because you've already thought about an issue and have already formulated a viewpoint about it. It's harder then to take into consideration other perspectives. So there's, I think, some interesting implications here for information literacy education. One is that simply being informed about a topic isn't enough for critical thinking, and sometimes it can even get in the way. And I think this also points to the value of pausing and really trying to notice one's initial response to certain information and allow oneself time to move beyond reactivity so that they can move into a more critical frame of mind. Another concept that my class explored was the idea of the web of belief. So this is a metaphor. It describes a spider web and makes that spider web a metaphor for our belief systems. So the idea here is that a spider web has a center or a core, and it also has a periphery or an outside. And at the core of the web are those beliefs that are the strongest. Those are things that are often very closely tied to our sense of self, ideas, beliefs that we probably have lived with for a very long time, perhaps since we were very, very young. And these are the most resistant to change. We want that spider web to remain intact and stable. So those beliefs that are at the core are the ones that are really kind of keeping the whole web intact. So it's very challenging to try to ask someone to change a core belief. On the outside or the periphery of the web, on the other hand, it's much easier to change those beliefs because they're not going to make the whole web collapse. So this can be helpful for thinking about how we think about other perspectives. I was also, in teaching this class, thinking a lot about how can I cultivate an inclusive learning environment. So there is a lot of research talking about positive class climate, using things like inclusive language to make sure that everyone feels welcome and that all people can feel like their experiences are seen and valued. This is really important for learning because when students feel a sense of threat, it is difficult for them to learn and it's difficult for them to engage with others. So the kind of class environment that cultivates openness and inquiry and a sense of social belonging will foster learning. So some things I did in addition to inclusive language and tone was establishing classroom ground rules with students where we talked about how we were going to treat each other. And we agreed to those in the beginning of the class. And we also focused a lot on raising our awareness of the roles that beliefs and identity play in human cognition and information behaviors. Another key concept in the class was that of intellectual empathy. Maureen Linker has written a really interesting book by that same name, Intellectual Empathy. And so we engaged with portions of that book during the class. So she is a philosopher, but she wrote this book for students. It's a book about critical thinking, basically. And she focuses on intellectual empathy as what she calls, quote, the cognitive affective elements of thinking about identity and difference. And she also makes the point that this often gets neglected in academic discourse, that often academic discourse, is presented as being impersonal, detached from emotion, detached from one's sense of self or social identity, when in reality, our thoughts are very much influenced by these things. And we need to develop awareness of that and sensitivity to it. So in exploring intellectual empathy, she is asking us to think about things like the web of belief. How does that influence how I engage with ideas, how I think about things, how I listen to other people's experiences, how I understand my own and others' experiences, including in relationship to one another. So some principles of intellectual empathy that she outlines are mutual compassion as a starting point, intersectionality, that is recognizing that advantage and disadvantage occur in a matrix, and recognizing the tendency for social privilege to be less visible to those who experience it.
Thanks, Andrea. I'm going to make a little bit of connection here between some of the principles that Andrea talked about and working with information literacy in the sciences. I cite William Perry a few times here. He had a seminal work in the 70s that's since been built on and by many, many people. But Perry developed a scheme for intellectual development in college, and I think it's still helpful for us to think about that. So information literacy in the science can complicate this dualistic thinking that is often a beginning of some of the intellectual stages of growth. So polarization can sometimes be a reflection of this dualistic thinking, or what Perry refers to as dualism, which again is a common stage of intellectual development for many students when they're entering college. Complicating dualistic notions surrounding scientific information can help to introduce the nuance which is necessary to consider that information in context. Shifting dualistic perspectives can involve highlighting the fact that the scholarly conversation in science doesn't happen in the popular media, and examining the role that the media does play in the public's understanding of scientific information. Using tools such as How Science Works, which is listed in our bibliography, can help students explore the processes of scientific knowledge and information and the way that it's created in more depth. Critical information literacy can also play a role in examining the situating of scientific issues within a broader social context. Identifying the stakeholders in scientific policies and looking at whether the information available represents them accurately or not at all can add a nuanced layer to thinking about how science impacts the world. Examining the voices of politics, corporations, funding agencies, and the spectrum of people affected by decisions involving science can highlight and question the types of information about science that are readily available to the public. The issue of uncertainty also comes up in dealing with science quite a bit. Personal uncertainty involves, it provides both a challenge and an opportunity for growth in information and scientific literacy and critical thinking. So personal uncertainty, which can take the form of having one's core beliefs questioned, like Andrea mentioned in the web of belief there, or being asked to hold ideas in tension, can be really unsettling, especially for a dualistic thinker. A sense of uncertainty can pose a risk to a person's identity and feeling of security. Sometimes this dynamic can underlie resistance to examining certain types of information more deeply. When places of personal resistance or tension come up in learning, it's important to give learners time and space for personal reflection to recognize and process their reactions. In science, a degree of uncertainty exists as a part of the scientific way of understanding the world and requires scientists to make decisions based on the best available evidence, which may change with increased knowledge. However, the fact that uncertainty within science exists doesn't mean the results of scientific inquiry are tenuous. The consensus of the scientific community is a concept that can be difficult to accept in tandem with a personal need for 100% certainty or proof. These polarities that we see in the ideas of theory versus fact and the idea of scientific proof don't accurately reflect how science works and are often exploited to political ends, as we've seen very recently with the anti-masking trend during the COVID pandemic. Claudia, are you muted?
Sorry, it had to happen, right? So in our center, we have a strong strategy for program evaluation and assessment of student learning. I should know I'm not at all biased because I am leading that part of the center, so, but that's another story. We collect data using surveys. Sara, on the next slide, please. Using surveys and focus groups, and also we analyze student artifacts. In this slide, I exemplify student responses from surveys on the table, skill gains. They are reporting gains in skills. They report gains in issues things related to evaluating science in popular media, recognizing different types of authority. In terms of evaluating science sources, in the bubbles, we see, for example, in the top bubble, we see that this student these are quotes from students' focus groups, and this student is letting us know that, in the lower bubble, that before he took the course, they took the course, they will really not look in a lot of depth, and they didn't care who wrote it and why was it posted where it was. But then after the course, they indicated that they focus on these type of things and go deeper to understand the content of the articles. They also report gains in recognizing and confronting their own biases in relation to science-related information sources. And they reported that they reported gains in being more open-minded with dealing with scientific controversies, when discussing scientific controversies with their peers. And in the top bubble, you can see that these students is alluding to having people with different types of thinking, and because these thoughts are so different, then sometimes they collide, but they report that from this type of thing, they can find their own shortcomings and other people's good ideas. So it relates to what Sara and Andrea were talking about. The next slide, please. In this slide, I want to share with you a brand new project that I am leading, and Sara and Gabe are collaborating, and other faculty in our center. And the goal of this project is to integrate science and information literacies. We are creating instructional modules to investigate the inequitable social, racial, and health structures that have become front and center during the COVID-19 pandemic. The modules use an interactive simulation where students can model infectious diseases process, and using the simulations, the students can learn about, of course, the science behind infectious diseases, basic concepts related to infectious diseases. And they can also model, as I said, these different disease scenarios by changing different parameters. So things like, they can change in the model things like mask wearing, race, socioeconomic status, and mortality rates, and then collect the data that the model is giving them as they change the scenarios. We complement the simulation with multimedia sources of information related to the social, economic, and health consequences of the pandemic, and more importantly, the disproportional effect that these negative effects that this is having in certain communities. The students come to us, and we know this, we know that this is how students learn. They come to us not as empty vessels, but they have their own worldviews, they have their beliefs, their biases, and these often shape their ideas and feelings about the roles and impacts of scientific knowledge in society. And this, of course, goes back to the discussion that Andrea was having as well. In this moment of crisis that we are now living, all of us, and socio-political polarization, these ideas and feelings and beliefs play an even more central role in how our students can react to science and perceive science. So things in this particular project, things like mask wearing, lockdowns, and other important mitigation strategies that are backed by scientific evidence, this should be taken as face value because of the scientific evidence that they have, but that they become polarizing controversies where the science takes a backstage, and all these feelings and emotions and polarization becomes the central part of it. So through the modules, our students have the possibility, the context to explore scientific facts, modeling disease scenarios, and they collect data and have evidence, and they use this evidence to understand the underlying mechanisms of social injustice and their effects on our communities. And also, it has a reflection part where students can think about their roles and responsibilities as members of a community to really transform our communities to be more just, equitable, and compassionate, which is something that we all know we need dearly right now.
So we've adopted a posture in our center where we're delivering science classes that are intentionally tackling challenging social topics. As a result, we need to encourage our faculty to anticipate that their classes are going to be engaging students with these polarizing topics. For many of our faculty, it's outside their comfort zone, and they've explained that. We've talked about that. So we try and work with them as much as possible. We emphasize the need for critical information literacy. We also talk a lot about fostering a safe and inclusive classroom culture as much as possible. Early on, setting classroom expectations and community norms, as Andrea mentioned. Also, as Andrea described, we attempt to posture ourselves as co-learners with our students and emphasize to our students that there's a real importance of practicing engaged and active listening. We cannot expect to force anybody to change their minds or adopt alternative viewpoints, but we really do want to encourage our students to listen to and to consider alternative and different perspectives. I realized in preparation for this that I find myself practicing what I'm not calling it tactical course delivery. And that's a nice thing, actually. Tactical meaning that I'm very intentional and kind of sequential in terms of what I ask my students to consider. For example, early on in our semester, when jumping into information literacy, I asked them to investigate what we mean by confirmation bias. And then in a group brainstorming session in small groups, I asked them to brainstorm what kinds of hot topics do they anticipate might come up in this class and that would lend themselves to confirmation bias. And I want to jump back now to the Google Docs that you folks have all done an amazing job, by the way. I'm not sure if my panel peers have had a chance to glance, but wow, there's some amazing stuff in there that I want to talk about, but we can't talk about it all. But what I see is collectively, you've identified lots of things that we do in fact tackle head on and directly, but also lots of things that kind of come up we don't expect them to, but wow, all of a sudden we're tackling things like racially charged issues, conversations, Islamophobia, immigration, white privilege, language that is harmful, fake news, gender identities and inequalities, gun ownership. These things come up in our classes. We don't expect that. On the other hand, lots of the responses I saw are related to things that we anticipate and directly tackle, like the oil and gas industry, environmental justice, and capitalism. I saw GMOs, vaccinations, mask wearing, climate change, and evolution. This list is very similar to what my students come up with. So with my students, I ask them to consider that there are shifting worldviews. And I try and start with old worldviews that we used to think, oh yeah, that's the way the world used to be. For example, how many people in this, we can't raise our hands here, but how many people here believe that there's likely possibly life elsewhere in the universe? And I'm guessing if my students are representative, about 85% are willing to say, yeah, there's probably life elsewhere. But my mother, when she was a student here at Michigan State University, the number of people who would respond that it was very different. As a result, our worldview has changed in that regard. And it's important for our students to recognize that that's the case. Similarly, and non-threatening, oh, plate tectonics. We all know and recognize that the continents are moving, but that wasn't the case when my mother was a little girl. So again, an example, a non-threatening example of shifting worldviews. Then though, we can begin to tackle things where the current worldview is a bit more tenuous. Should we or should we not use DDT to control malaria? Now, some students have a strong feeling about this, some might not know, but that's also a socially charged an environmental justice issue. Issues like vaccinations and masks, climate change. I'd like to mention evolution. Without question, there's a shift in worldview about evolution, and we talk in our class about evolution. I want to go back to Andrea's point about the web of belief. And I try to not jump directly into evolution, but instead begin to tinker with some of those peripheral beliefs, those peripheral topics. For example, asking students to consider what pieces of evidence are you familiar with that we use to tell us something about the past? And they say, oh, well, we've got tree rings and we've got pollen grains in the sediments of ponds, or we've got ice cores. Absolutely. But also we can look at geologic features that we can visibly see that give evidence that our planet is actually millions or billions of years old, and they can't kind of disagree with that. And that's the first step. We need that in order to have a conversation about evolution. So if we can change their mind about evidence for the age of the planet, perhaps we can begin to have them consider alternatives on other topics as well.
I'm muted again. Really quickly here, just a quick connection between the scientific literacies that Gabe and Claudia focus on in their classes and information literacy. One way that we can look at these is moving from this binary of what we hear often, which are good and bad sources, to talking about authority and its creation and context. So which site is good for? So a site saying that the earth is flat would not be good for scientific evidence, but it would be good if you're studying conspiracy theories, right? So looking at evidence and context. Also looking at those types of evidence. What kinds of evidence is a source using? Are they using scientific evidence, personal experience? Are they using anecdotal or rhetorical evidence? And matching those sources of evidence up with the questions being asked or the problem being posed. Using a stakeholder focus helps us ask that critical question of what information and voices are left out of those sources. For example, Claudia often talks about, a choice that someone in a developing country may have to make to use pesticides on their crops or not survive, right? So there's some voices that we don't often hear in conversations like that surrounding science. And the other one is looking at science as a disciplinary way of thinking. And so having a very a set way that scientific information is looked at and created and processed and disseminated can also give us that context to transfer that into looking at information in a scientific, with a scientific viewpoint.
Thank you, Sarah. So you can see that we're back to our Google Docs, and I realize people are putting some great questions in the chat, and thank you. Sam, I think, is taking care of putting those in Google Doc that we will get to. But we wanted you to also have a chance to come back to the topics or scenarios you identified earlier in the session, and to now engage with the second question on that Google Doc. So you can see that the links to the Google Docs are in there again. And this time we're asking you, are there any activities or approaches that you've taken or might take which could help students think about their own cognitive processes in relation to information that reinforces or challenges their beliefs? So we'll take about we said 5 minutes originally. Do you all think that would still work? 5 minutes, or do we?
We may want to shrink it down just a little bit.
We want to do maybe like 4. So we'll take about 4 minutes for you to go back to those Google Docs and share ideas there, and then we'll come back together.
And right now you do have 7 questions, just to kind of keep that in your mind as we're heading towards the 2 p.m. Central Time mark.
Okay, thank you.
I'm also going to pause my screen share here so I can view your Google Docs.
Yeah, there are very interesting questions in the chat. Thank you for that.
Yeah.
And if you're done with the Google Doc too, you can also start putting questions in the chat as well for us to continue to collect, and we'll go in the order which we received them.
Yeah, Gabe, I think I agree with you. If the activity is slowing down in the docs, we have very interesting questions in the chat that I hope we have time to address.
And we are collecting the questions in the chat as well. And if we hit the 3 p.m. mark, we will, if the panelists feel comfortable, they can share their emails as well. And we have the questions, you know, so we'll try to maybe address them in the presentation or something if we can't get to all of them.
Do you folks want to just go ahead and come back then from the break for the Google Docs?
Given again, I'm not seeing rapid activity like I was before.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So I have to say, I'm still digesting because there's so much stuff in here. I'm still digesting things. And I mean,
There's a ton.
a couple of themes that are coming out for me are presenting perspectives to students that they're usually not exposed to. That was something that I was noticing. Someone saying using reflective questions. I also saw people saying that they were seeing conflict sometimes between among different marginalized groups. If I read that comment correctly. So I'm seeing a lot of things, but more than I can, that I'm able to digest in this short time period. Others, Sara, Gabe, Claudia, are there comments you want to make about what you're seeing in the documents?
I've seen a couple of comments about mindfulness, about students asking questions about their own, being aware of their own reactions, which is something that I'm really interested in. I think that's something that we neglect really often when we're talking about information literacy, because it's not always that objective point that we're, that we've talked about a little bit here. So I think those are excellent. One point I want to make too is that we'll leave these documents up for a while, because I'm gonna definitely want to go back and look at these in depth. So we will have these up if participants, you want to keep that link, and you can look at these more after our session is over also. Gabe, Claudia, anything you want to mention in there?
Yeah, well, perhaps not in the Google Docs, but I have a question here that is very interesting. Is Audrey gone? And she asks, how can librarians effectively teach authority is constructed and contextual in the sciences when science faculty often require all sources to be peer-reviewed articles? I worry that this requirement causes the students to view peer review as the only form of authority truth, but I ultimately don't get to decide what sources the students are allowed to use. That is a very, very good point, because this is something that, especially when you're teaching non-STEM students that are not going to become scientists, well, they might, but not right now. They are pursuing other disciplines. And that is exactly right. That is also an expectation that students have, right? Okay, so science, and this is one of the reasons that people kind of don't connect with science, because these scholarly written articles are very dry, seem very dry and difficult to engage with. So when teaching the students that are non-STEM majors, it is very important to contextualize what type of information they are going to have access to. And for example, Sara helped me put together one module in one of my classes that was dealing with issues about, what was it, Sara? It was water. So students were researching issues of water in different parts, and they had the very scientific point of view, and they also have the personal experiences of people that were confronting the problem. And the way we did this, the students were reflecting about, okay, there is this type of scientific authority, but there is also this personal experience that gives this person a huge authority over the issue. And this is a perspective that should be heard, not only reported in the media, but by scientists, right? So that this can be used by more people. And I think we're moving towards not really making scholarly articles the center of the discussion, because exactly of what you are saying in your question. So thank you, Audrey. That was a very good question.
So there's a lot of other questions going on. So do you want Leeanne or I to start from the beginning? And we'll just try to knock off as many as we can.
Can we finish the presentation real quick? Just a couple more slides, and then yes, we would love to hear some of those questions.
Okay.
Okay. Okay, so I think we're going to move on from here just to make sure that we get our last few in here. So really quick, I'll go quickly just to sum up here. I want to talk a little bit about metacognition and reflection. So a key question for us to consider is, what is our role as teachers? So metacognition, which is the ability to think about one's own processes of learning and understanding, is an essential part of meta-literacy, and it's an underlying information literacy theory which is proposed and discussed by Jacobson and Mackey. And in the book Women's Ways of Knowing, Belenky and her co-authors discuss metacognition in the form of connected teaching, that teachers are aware and supportive of the processes going on when a student's thinking evolves. Part of this process includes an awareness of the web of belief and the potential risks to students whose thinking is evolving. Connected teaching, as discussed in Women's Ways of Knowing, also involves empathy and a certain vulnerability to expose and model our own thought processes for the sake of learning. This willingness for an instructor to learn alongside students is a key component of critical pedagogy and can also model Perry's commitment and relativism stage of intellectual development for dualistic learners. This stage reflects how a person integrates different types of evidence with their own personal experiences, emotions, and reactions in order to make an informed decision. And this process involves personal reflection. So examining how one's own personal reactions to information might impact our ability to consider different types of evidence is key to developing an ability to see beyond these polarized binaries and consider nuance. It's important for learners to become self-aware of the ways that they learn and process information. We also want to think, and I saw this in the Google Docs as well, about supporting our own reflective practice as teachers. So the last thing that we'd want folks to take away from this presentation is that the idea that we all should be responding to learners in exactly the same way. So our aim is to support you to make your own decision-making processes about your own teaching. So this kind of decision-making requires patience with ourselves and awareness of our own reactive tendencies. It's hard to know how to handle an evolving thinker, and especially when they hold views that are harmful to you or to others. So being aware of our own reactions helps us to make choices in how we do this, both in the classroom and in our curriculum, rather than reacting from a place of impulse. And as we've recently been reminded so vividly that misinformation can and does lead to violence, it's important to be aware of how much we're personally able to maintain a balanced sense of justice and hospitality when we're working with students. There are times when we certainly need to correct misinformation directly and swiftly, and there are times when it might be appropriate to work with students to bring them along more slowly. There are also times when we are not the person to handle the situation, nor should we be expected to. So it's not a cut and dry choice, and the context will vary according to your own experiences, situations, and positionality, and whether or not harm is being actively perpetuated to you or to others. So nonetheless, we all have opportunities to make an impact for growth and development in understanding this nuance and the ability to bring about an awareness of justice with our students. So I just wanted to say that just to sum up that, again, all of us come from different places, and some of us are better equipped to move along with students at a slower pace, and some of us just can't, and that's okay. So, you know, being aware of your own ability to handle some of these issues is something that's key as we're going forward and strategizing. So with that, I believe that that is the end of our content here. And so at this point, we would love to hear some more of your questions and get to those as much as we possibly can. So yeah, if you'd just like to start at the beginning, or pick out ones that you think have not yet been answered, or that could benefit from some more discussion.
Great. Well, I'll start with the first one, which is actually pretty easy. Andrea, could you share the syllabus outline for your information literacy course?
Yeah, I'm happy to do that. If anyone is interested in that, you're welcome to email me. So I'm going to put my email in the chat.
Right there.
And similarly, if there are things that we don't get to today, you know, please feel free to reach out to me. Yeah.
Thank you. And I have a comment here that versus a question, just that your spider's web metaphor, Andrea, reminded the participant of a Wikipedia page. So I've left the link in the.
Thank you so much. I'm gonna definitely look at that. I really appreciate it. I'm looking forward to looking at it.
So the next question is related to media. Do you have to clarify social justice concepts to students in class? And if so, how or when do you do it? Following up, what perceptions do they come to the classroom with? For example, watching Fox News, the participant sees that they sometimes frame social justice as wanting to create outcome equality. But when one reads the literature, that is not true. The media seems to play on fears of socialism and communism. Do you have to address that in the classroom? Thank you.
Gabe, Claudia.
The first part of these, in terms of, do we have to clarify social justice concepts to students in class? In my practice, and perhaps because we come from the scientific perspective and we really what we're teaching is science, right? It's more tangential, not that it means that it's less important, but I try to take my students to these social justice concepts and issues by exposing them to media, right? By giving them access to read things, to look at videos, and to make the connections about, always to me, the connection between science and society is very, very central. And of course, just social justice issues will come across every time that we do this. So then we engage in discussions and reflections, and that's the way that I do it in my class.
And I was going to argue, or not argue, but suggest that I think that certainly in an environmental science course, a lot of our students arrive not recognizing that there are connections between environment and their own choices. In thinking about fashion, fast fashion, they're excited about fast fashion, but they on the surface it's easy to go buy a new pair of shoes and be excited about that. But if they're asked to dig in and look at the pathway that it took to result in making that available to us at such an inexpensive cost. And then we begin to think about, well, where was it produced and why was it produced there? And we realize, oh, there's really inexpensive labor. And if you actually show them the conditions for which the people are working in to produce that thing, all of a sudden they're like, oh boy, I did not realize that. Or slave labor for production of chocolate, or the oil fields in Niger River Delta. I think there's a lack of understanding about the relationship between global environmental justice issues and consumerism here in the United States. So it's not socialism as I can avoid socialism. It's just show them where this stuff is actually happening and help them recognize what it takes to make aspects of our culture move forward. And they get uncomfortable because they don't want to be a part of that.
If I can, I know we only have 1 minute, so I was going to make a comment, but I don't know, Sam, if we need to stop talking.
So I added Lauren. I don't know if you're in here, but typically, yeah, we have to give up this room right at 3.
Yep.
Or, sorry, right at 2 Central Time. We have questions and we have been collecting all the questions in the chat, and you all see the email addresses on the screen. We also can try to quickly drop them in the chat. Overall, thank you for coming. There will be a recording of this. I dropped the link to the presentation slides and the evaluation. Please take that evaluation before you leave. It's in the chat. Thank you so much to all of our panelists for sharing your expertise with us today. I would also like to thank Eloy Sharp and Lauren Carlton from ACRL for helping us coordinate this. Remember that we will send the link to the recording and the presentation, which includes all of these links to the Google Doc and what the panelist covers today when it's available. Again, I'm going to drop that evaluation form one more time. And again, excuse me, sorry, we're right at time. So thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.